Thank you so much for attending this session. Researching feminism and feminist organizing in Alberta is a new project for me. I was able to make one short trip to the Provincial Archives of Alberta to read the records of the Alberta Status of Women Action Committee funds before the pandemic, and from now on I'm going to call them Aswac. I'm very grateful for the work of the Rise Up Digital Feminist Archives Collective for making the newsletters of so many feminist organizations accessible for reaching and teaching. I could not have participated in this conference if they had not digitized the Aswac newsletters. I decided to do this research for a couple of reasons. First, as Julia Smith has noted, in her research about women's union organization in Western Canada, we know very little about women's organizing in Alberta in the post-war era. There's Andrea Samoil's excellent doctoral research on women's strikes during the Klein period, and Carissa Patton and Carol Williams have done some excellent work on reproductive justice, but also in particular on opposition to reproductive justice. There's one history published in 2003 by political scientist Lois Harder called State of Struggle, and I'm going to come back to that book in a little while. As we begin to historicize the period between post-war and present day, historians will most likely look to the prairie provinces for the emergence of social conservatism. If Alberta is understood as the cradle of neoliberal politics in Canada, and I'm not sure that it should be, then we should consider the history of opposition to it. The second reason is personal. When Judy Revick was in town promoting her really excellent memoir, Heroes in My Head, she referred to Yvonne Stanford, Nancy Miller, and Pam Krause, the Alberta NAC representative she worked with when she was president of NAC, as her Alberta Dream Team. Now, these women are some of my mentors, and they have taught me much about feminist organizing in Alberta. The personal is political. In my blog post for the Wilson Institute series on the history of neoliberalism that uses some of the research that I'm presenting here, I wrote about reading the Aswac newsletters alongside present-day feminist analysis of the post-pandemic recovery, and I've dropped a link to that in the chat. I made the rather ahistorical argument that there isn't really much new in current feminist economic analysis. There are fundamental consistencies between earlier feminist analysis and current concerns. First, the marginalization of women in the workforce. Second, the undervaluation of caregiving work. And third, the disproportionate impact of cuts to the public sector and social welfare programs on women. So in this presentation, I want to provide some more historical context for the political and social events that shaped Aswac's intervention into the economic debates of the 1980s and 1990s. I'll begin with a brief history of Aswac's founding, its structure, and its relationship to NAC. It was during NAC's campaign against free trade that Aswac organizers really began to emphasize the importance of economic knowledge from a feminist perspective to counter cuts to the public service. Aswac's emphasis on economic education built on its analysis of feminization of poverty. That was part of its pay equity campaigns and things that it was working on before this and alongside this. At the provincial level, the STORD, which is what they called the combination of the staff and the board, decided to take women and make women in poverty its central campaign in 1987. Based on findings from their meetings with women across Alberta, they published a report called Women Against Poverty in 1989. Now, I've had limited access to our library, as we all have, so I really haven't had a chance to read this report yet. So my preliminary analysis today is based on reports about the research in their newsletter. In the pages of the Aswac newsletter, activists identified global neoconservative shifts that undermined local efforts to defend national social welfare states and the provincial programs that women require for equal participation in the workforce. They also challenged portrayals of the masculine political economy of Alberta. So let's start with background and how the organization was founded. It was founded in 1986, right? And Aswac mobilized feminist organizing in the province until the Klein government disbanded it in 1997. In 1975, Alberta feminists organized regional workshops in Grand Prairie, Calgary, Edmonton, and Lethbridge. These workshops informed their brief to the Alberta government entitled Joint Initiatives, a Goal for Women and Government in Alberta. The following year, they held a province-wide conference and established a permanent organization to coordinate local feminist activism. The organization's initial strategy was to lobby for an advisory council on the status of women and for a minister responsible for the status of women. Now, as you know, this was a recommendation of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. Alberta was the only province that did not establish an advisory council. It did have a minister, but it didn't establish the council. In 1986, the province announced that it would establish a Women's Advisory Council. This was a citizens' council with a mandate to increase awareness about women's issues and to advise the minister. It had no mandate to improve the status of women. The government appointed television personality Margaret Leahy as its chair. Aswac activists were opposed to this appointment because she had no connection to the women's movement, and she positioned herself primarily as a wife and a mother. They were livid when she told the press that she'd, quote, like to have a very strong male, a key decision maker from the private sector on the council. I want to work with somebody who has a lot of influence over women's lives, a major employer, end quote. She went on to say, quote, I want to work with men. I don't want to work against them, end quote. Aswac also demanded that this council should be diverse, right? Because many Alberta women, they argued, were poor, single mothers, divorced, widowed, Native, and members of ethnic minorities. Right, so this demand for diversity on the council was coinciding with discussions about outreach to Indigenous and racialized women's organization, and also coincided with the anti-racism training among Aswac activists. I want to take a bit of time to talk about the new right? Because this was, as you know, the mid-1980s was a time when the federal government began to restructure the women's program within the Secretary of State that so many feminist groups relied on. Aswac encouraged women to write their MPs to tell them how much you appreciate Aswac's work towards your liberation. Under the Mulroney government, the anti-feminist pro-life organization Real Women began to receive funding from the Secretary of State. Aswac advised its members to write their MPs to oppose this, quote, before the right rears its ugly head and poisoned pencils, end quote. Now, the inspiration for Real Women was an Alberta group, the Alberta Federation of Women United for the Family. And they're called, I'll call them AFWA from now on. And they were founded in 1982. Now, I've just submitted a grade for an excellent honors thesis by Jewel Bohach about this organization. AFWA was established to oppose Aswac's work after pro-life activists' memberships were revoked from Aswac, right, because they disrupted meetings in order to bring anti-abortion resolutions to the floor. And they also were disrupting other workshops by trying to talk about anti-abortion issues. Aswac was a pro-choice organization. AFWA's founding members were active in many pro-life groups in Alberta, mainly around Red Deer, and they organized to oppose feminist issues that they viewed as threats to the traditional family. Those issues were daycare, pay equity, and gay and lesbian rights. Now, initially, Aswac opposed the Women's Advisory Council. They were appeased by the appointment of Leahy, and they became active advocates in and for the council. And their relationship with the government improved during this period, and in part because by the 1990s, a couple of the leadership members were married to conservative MLAs. Now, Aswac members had long debated the usefulness of lobbying the provincial government, and the establishment of the Women's Advisory Council seems to have really been a last straw for them. They start to become more militant in their activism after this. Frustrated with the government's resistance to developing policy to address gender inequalities, the organization, beginning in 1979, was starting to reorient to focus on grassroots organizing. Now, political scientist Lois Harder is critical of Aswac for doing this. She argues that by adopting a militant stance against the government, they diminish their influence in government as effective lobbyists. Aswac didn't really abandon lobbying, though. Their frustration with working with politicians appointed to address women's issues, but who rejected feminist analysis and insisted that women and men were equal, made them skeptical about the utility of working with governments and with the provincial government in particular. They decided to focus on building a movement committed to advancing women's equality. And a necessary component of this work was to make Alberta women aware of their work, skill, strength, needs, fears, anger, and activities. They always debated lobbying. Whether or not to lobby was an ongoing debate in the Aswac newsletters. I want to talk now about their relationship to NAC. Aswac had always been affiliated with NAC, but in the mid-1980s, staff and board members promoted a stronger relationship to the national organization. Not all Aswac members were keen on this because they thought that NAC was an institution that was removed from grassroots feminism, and this was a common argument like in this period. A poem by Deborah Parrott, who was the Aswac representative at the 1987 NAC AGM, criticized the executive's bureaucratic process. The poem is called NAC, the organization that speaks nicely to politicians. And I'll just read the first stanza. Robert rules and orders the gathering of women's spirit, the scent of wild woman caged in friendly amendments, the passion of inaction stolen by outsiders jealous and fearful of the birth of ourselves for ourselves. And it goes on. In her report on the Congress, Parrott argued that the structure of the conference was somewhat intimidating and silencing because controversial resolutions were sent to the executive, which centralized the decision-making process. Another report on the NAC conference stated that people with letters behind their names might be comfortable in this setting, but not grassroots feminists. Rebecca Coulter, who was at this time the Alberta regional representative, responded to these criticisms, warning that it set up a false dichotomy between grassroots and academic feminists. And here she cited Marjorie Griffin Cohen as an academic who did important research that was supporting the work of grassroots organization. She's referring here, right, to the book on free trade, which I'll talk about a bit later. She also warned that setting up these divisions fed into right-wing stereotypes about NAC. It was through their work with NAC that Aswac members encouraged women to engage in economic debates, especially in the free trade debates. Feminist publications then, like the Aswac newsletter, taught women that their experiences mattered. It encouraged women not to be intimidated by economists and pundits who dismissed gender analysis and insisted that deregulation, deficit reduction, and privatization were necessary for economic growth in the new global economy. Mobilizing their anger at the government's unwillingness to acknowledge that Alberta's male-dominated resource-based economy and austerity measures deepened gender, race, and class inequalities, Aswac activists drew on national and international debates to develop sophisticated economic analysis grounded in women's experiences in Alberta. Lack of opportunity for advancement in education or in jobs with good wages, especially again in the resource extraction industries that dominated the Alberta economy, deepened economic inequality between men and women, they argued. Improving women's economic status was a priority, especially since there were few opportunities for women outside of service and care work, and those sectors, of course, paid much less than resource jobs. Privatization was also a big concern for Aswac. Public sector jobs had provided opportunities for better wages and advancement in the 1970s, but cuts to public service at both federal and provincial levels in the 1980s undermined the gains that women had made in the public sector. Aswac activists were critical of privatization. The 1984 decision to eliminate the provincial government temporary staff program, which replaced full-time union jobs with contract workers from private sectors, or private agencies rather, was, according to one Aswac activist who was concerned about her own job, one example of how, quote, women were losers in a false economy. She argued that unionized government jobs enabled women to support their families. She stated that she would not work for minimum wage and she would not work without benefits because these agencies and their shareholders were, quote, putting furs on their backs and rings on their fingers by charging their clients double what I earn. Feminists argue that because women relied on the public sector, in particular healthcare, education, and social services, government cuts had a disproportionate impact on women. Anne McGrath, who at the time was the Aswac staff person in the Calgary office, told women that they had to fight back. She wrote, quote, women in particular experience the burden of many of these policies, and women are at the forefront of the fight for fairness. I think that the government has underestimated the commitment and strength of a unified, determined, and angry population, end quote. Fighting back required knowledge. Aswac reprinted the articles from NAC and other provincial status of women advisory council letters that argued that government deficits were the result of tax breaks to corporations and wealthy individuals, not excessive public sector spending. For example, in 1979 article by the Saskatchewan Action Committee on the Status of Women argued, quote, conservative governments are attempting to dismantle the social structures that have been built into the public sector by playing on people's fears about debts and deficits, end quote. Aswac activists encourage women to read economic theory so that they could challenge narrow definitions of the economy that focused on the private sector and undervalued women's paid and unpaid labor. And of course, all of this was wrapped up in the free trade debates. The emphasis of engaging in economic debate was, again, I think, in Aswac, inspired by the free trade debates. Aswac activists insisted that women had to overcome their wariness about speaking about complex economic policy decisions. The newsletter covered Marjorie Griffin Cohen's 1987 book, Free Trade and the Future of Women's Work. And in this book, Griffin Cohen outlined concerns about the impact of trade liberalization on manufacturing sectors dominated by women, and also the impact that it would have on the public sector. To empower women to engage in complex economic decisions, policy decisions, the newsletter under this report on Griffin Cohen's book, published definitions of economic terms that were associated with the free trade agreement. And this list included balance of trade, countervailing duty, dispute settlement mechanism, and GATT. My favorite definition, though, was harmonization, singing together, as when Brian and Ronnie share a rendition of When Irish Eyes Are Smiling, and the tendency of policy, social and foreign, of free trading nations to become identical. That was the only definition that had a joke embedded in it. The rest of them were very serious definitions. So now I want to turn and switch gears a little bit and talk about their Women Against Poverty campaign. Aswac joined coalitions and rallies that opposed government cuts in the 1980s and in the 1990s. While they maintained their demands for economic equality for women, their focus in the mid-1980s was on the feminization of poverty. This too required knowledge. In 1987, Aswac committed to reaching out to poor women across Alberta to understand how and why they were living in poverty. This research informed a public education campaign to help Albertans and the government understand the systemic reasons for poverty. In Alberta, 68% of women were not unionized, and 2/3 of women worked for a minimum wage. Activists organized women in poverty groups in their cities. Now, the Calgary group called their group Women Against Calgary, and eventually the entire organization took up that name. Aswac had 6 demands, including doubling the minimum wage to $7.60, accessible, affordable childcare, benefits for part-time and casual workers, and raising welfare rates above the poverty line. Local groups organized poverties. Now, these were neighborhood tea parties to bring together women to discuss their experiences and friends' experience of poverty or the threat of poverty. They identified 2 myths that perpetuated systemic inequality. First, the silent reality of poverty in Alberta, which was again perpetuated by a myth promoted by government leaders and the popular media that women had made it economically. Second, they were frustrated that they still had to challenge the idea that women worked for pin money or were secondary income earners. 46% of women who worked for wages were the only wage earner in their family. If women discussed their experiences of living in poverty, the organizers believed that it would challenge the stigma of living in poverty by helping them to understand the systemic reasons for the feminization of poverty. So collecting women's stories about the day-to-day concerns about paying rent or feeding their children then would become the foundation of lobbying for legislation that would address those barriers. I'm going to wrap up here by way of conclusion, right? I don't have definite conclusions for you right now because, as I said earlier, this is very preliminary research. The title of my paper is "Many of Us Can No Longer Stomach these forms of lobbying." Now, Lois Harder uses this quotation in her analysis of feminist politics to argue that Aswac became less effective as an organization because they abandoned lobbying to take up a more militant stance against the Alberta government. My reading of the newsletter and the archival documents is different. Rather than abandoning lobbying, they question the usefulness of traditional forms of lobbying, with ministers who labeled Aswac as shrill feminists or who denied systemic gender inequalities. They expanded definitions of lobbying to include public education that also challenged narrow definitions of the economy that focused on the private sector and ignored the importance of the sectors where women worked. Aswac reminded women of the importances of their experiences and their voices and advised them to write letters and to advance to social justice. Aswac was more militant in its opposition to the provincial government, but in Alberta in the 1980s and 90s, so were all unions and progressive organizations. Thank you very much.